Okay, so on the indexed public debt, I would be categorically against it. It's potentially explosively inflationary, and the same thing can be accomplished with simple uh, by simply allowing what's been happening now, which is the pesos that are being deficit spent simply sit as reserves on in the banking system. In this case, it would be excess reserves. They're above and beyond required reserves, but they're reserve balances at the central bank in the banking system. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that policy. It is not inflationary. I know the IMF is demanding that longer term securities be sold. If you have to do that, I would do as short a term peso security as possible. And yes, the interest rates are going to be higher because they're going to reflect the anticipated short-term rate settings by the central bank, but it's still far better alternative than to using the index debt, which just turns into which is a case of a very, very what you'd call in economics an unstable equilibrium. The worse it gets, the worse it gets, the worse it gets, and it can just spiral against you. So that's my response to that question. But more to the point, I would also highly recommend a permanent zero rate policy, in which case all the peso debt would be paid. There'd be no interest charged on it. You'd still have excess balances at the central bank. However, they would not be interest bearing. And so you would have a permanent zero interest rate policy that way. And that would be my first recommendation. The reason is one of the primary sources of inflation right now that I see is the payment of interest by the Argentine government, either through the central bank or through the treasury, depending on where the balances sit, on whose balance sheet the balances sit. But either way, the government itself is paying that interest expense, and it's just adding gasoline to the fire. When you have a positive rate of interest, you are paying new pesos to people who already have money in proportion to how much money they have. You might call it basic income for people who already have money, which is, to me, one of the worst possible policies you could pursue. And those pesos, extra pesos that are being earned by the people who already have money, are largely being sold for dollars and driving the currency down. So I think the IMF has it backwards. I think the higher rates are counterproductive and working to perpetuate the inflation. And that, to me, is obvious in both theory and in practice. All the evidence points to exactly that situation. So I'd be categorically against that. Now, when we look at the limits of government spending, you have to remember that interest payments are government spending. Yes, they're not part of the primary deficit, but the reason we separate primary deficit from deficit caused by interest expense is anachronistic. That goes back to the gold standard of fixed exchange rates and doesn't apply today. Today, for all practical purposes, the spending is spending, and you have to look at all of it. So when you start spending government money on interest payments, it adds to the deficit being spending in excess of taxation. The interest is pure spending in excess of taxation. It goes purely into the demand side. It doesn't produce anything for sale on the other side. And it goes largely to people who won't spend a lot of it, but the part they don't spend, they spend on pesos. I mean, selling their pesos to buy dollars or maybe euro, driving the currency down, which then causes inflation to go higher, which then causes the IMF to command that you have even higher rates. So again, it's what I referred to earlier with the index bonds. It's all kind of the same thing. It's this unstable equilibrium that's created by a policy of paying what they call a real rate of interest, a nominal interest rate higher than the inflation rate. You're just chasing your tail. It doesn't end. Okay, and so I'd be categorically against that. So now when we look at the limits to peso spending, there are no limits. You can buy anything that's for sale. There are no limits to how much interest you can pay. You can pay all you want. The problem is the consequences from that spending. And right now, the consequences from excess spending, which includes the spending on interest, is the inflation. And it's not at the macro level. It's at the micro level, in that It's the specific spending that's causing the inflation. You could spend as much as is being spent now, but on different things, and then you would get a far more subdued inflationary response, if any. So if instead of the money spent going to, in a highly concentrated form, to a very small group of people who sell those pesos for dollars and euro, it went to lower income people who would either pay down their debt or not have as much debt. But if it went into private sector debt reduction, into areas of debt reduction, then it would not have the inflationary effect through spending, and it would not have the inflationary effect through feeding pesos into the foreign exchange market, which is what the current policy is doing, and what I say needs to be stopped immediately.